Hi, I'm Ryan Smansky, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. Today we're going to talk about the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, the third of the five great carrier battles fought between the United States Navy and the Imperial Japanese Navy during World War II. Just like our last video on Savo Island and our next couple of videos that are coming up, this is one of the battles that was fought for control of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands in the Southwest Pacific. Guadalcanal contained a Japanese-built airfield that the United States was able to capture and put aircraft on. It was named Henderson Field by the Americans, and with the aircraft from here, the Americans were able to completely control the waters around the Solomon Islands by day. However, at night when the aircraft weren't flying, the Japanese were able to supply the island. Really, with just the 12 hours of daylight for the Americans to resupply, the 12 hours of darkness for the Japanese to supply, neither fleet could deploy as many supplies as their troops on the ground needed. So because of this, each side decided they needed a decisive battle to defeat the enemy's navy. And the new arm of that decisive battle was the aircraft carrier. So the United States deployed all three of their large carriers in the South Pacific. USS Saratoga, which had survived earlier battles by avoiding them entirely because she was continuously being torpedoed by Japanese submarines and missing battles. She was the flagship of Admiral Fletcher. USS Enterprise, which had avoided no battles and just been a generally lucky ship up until this point, and would go on to be the most decorated ship in the U.S. Navy ever, with 20 battle stars to her name, one more than Battleship New Jersey, and the ill-fated USS Wasp, which was a generally inferior design for a fleet carrier, which resulted from the international naval treaties of the 1930s. She was just a wastebasket for an extra 17,000 tons the United States had lying around, and ended up being too small and slow to be particularly effective. The Japanese, on the other hand, had the two best aircraft carriers in the world, Shokaku and Suikaku. They also had the light carrier Junyo. And not only were Shokaku and Suikaku the best design carriers in the world at this time, they also had the best trained air crews and the best aircraft. Their aircraft far outranged the American counterparts, and their pilots had considerably more experience. Although the field was narrowing at this point in the war, as American aviators had now gained combat experience. Both sides knew that the enemy was out there, but had no idea what the enemy's disposition was, or if they were even coming and seeking battle. So after several days of searching for the Japanese unsuccessfully, Admiral Fletcher sent Wasp 2 days to the south to refuel. And so Wasp would miss this battle, which is no great loss in terms of a ship. However, it is a great loss in terms of the 72 aircraft over air group. And this really evened it out. Additionally, each side had land air bases that they could use. Neither side's land base, air base, took too much into carrier battles, although they did do a lot of searching. The Japanese, in typical fashion, deployed an overly complex deployment, which they brought out every single ship they had, regardless of the fuel costs. It's not like Japan's an island that has limited fuel reserves or anything. And so they brought out a huge transport force, which was going to bring reinforcements to the island. But these transports were incredibly slow. They brought out their carrier force. They had their state-of-the-art heavy cruisers, but they were distantly guarding. They weren't actually escorting the transports or the carriers or doing anything meaningful at all. And they also had battleships. They deployed a number of battleships, and they actually did something really neat here. After learning their mistakes from Midway, where their battleships were deployed behind their carriers and therefore took no part in the battle despite consuming 6 months' worth of fuel in a single operation, they put their battleships in front of their carriers, hoping that American aviators would discover their battleships instead of their carriers and attack their nearly invulnerable battleships instead of their quite vulnerable carriers. Also, when the American carriers had been swept aside, their battleships could continue on and destroy the American fleet's remaining ships in a gunfight. Even though carriers dominated warfare at this point, everyone still thought that battleships had a serious role to play in a final decisive battle destroying the enemy's fleet. The commander of the Japanese fleet was Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had previously lost Midway but was still in command at this point. And the commander of the American fleet was Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, who had won Midway despite being extremely conservative in his actions. And both of these men realized that they have their entire Navy's best hopes and chances under their command. They're only major carriers, and if they lose these, then they basically lost the war in the afternoon. So both of these individuals end up fighting extremely conservatively. The one positive thing about the Japanese force dispositions were the United States never really knew where the Japanese force was. So in that, it worked perfectly. I don't believe that the Americans ever found the Japanese fleet carriers, and they never really launched a strike against them. They did find the light carrier Junyo, who was supporting from a separate group, and a partial strike was launched against her that was able to disable her. The Japanese were able to find the American force eventually, and they launched a strike primarily comprised of dive bombers against the American carriers, and they focused primarily on Enterprise. They didn't really focus on Saratoga at all. Enterprise, although she was fairly maneuverable and able to dodge a number of these attacks, and although she had her anti-aircraft guns upgraded since early in the war, she was still took 3 bomb hits, which damaged her badly and caused her to have to return to Pearl Harbor for repairs that would put her out of the war for another month or so. She would not, however, miss a major carrier battle because of that. Otherwise, lessons that were brought into the battle, neither side really deployed their torpedo planes. Midway had showed that the torpedo planes, although the torpedoes stood a far greater chance of destroying the enemy warship, the torpedo planes, which had to fly low and slow in order to drop their torpedoes, were easy prey for enemy fighters and anti-aircraft guns. The Japanese were still using the Kate, which was a pretty good torpedo plane, but was getting kind of old at this point. And the Americans had switched from the older Devastators, which had been obliterated at Midway, in favor of the newer Avengers, which had also been pretty badly damaged at Midway, but were generally a much better aircraft. And torpedoes didn't play a large part in this battle, and so you don't see many ships damaged. So the major fleet action ends up being more or less a draw. Both sides score some damage, nothing significant. Both sides retreat. Where the actual success from the battle comes in was the Japanese convoy force. So this fleet was supposed to bring all of the heavy supplies and weapons and reinforcements for the Japanese. Well, the Americans are able to find it, launch aircraft at it, and destroy a number of ships. And eventually, rather than going to Guadalcanal, it diverts to another island. And the Japanese decide that instead of sending in slow, vulnerable transports, they're going to have to load all the supplies on fast-moving destroyers and send it overnight. This means that they're never going to get any of the heavy supplies or large artillery that they need to really take the island. Also, destroyers consume considerably more fuel than a transport ship. And so they continue to consume their limited fuel resources doing what will become known as the Tokyo Express. So in this regard and otherwise, draw of a battle becomes an American strategic success. Really, of all the carrier battles of the war, this one is the least important. And the results are, it more or less defers things a couple of months until the two fleets can get back together and attack each other again. The Japanese did lose a lot of their trained carrier pilots, and because of the Japanese institution of training pilots, it took them much longer to replace a pilot than it took the United States. In the United States, the pilot goes out, they fly a couple of missions, they go back and they train more pilots, and the experience then transfers from pilot to pilot to pilot. With the Japanese, they spent a long time training them, so they became very proficient, and then they deployed them, and they never recalled them, so they continued to fly operation after operation until they're dead. And they end up becoming extremely capable pilots, but by this point in the war, American tactics and technology has negated a lot of their skill, and so when one of these pilots dies, they cannot be replaced. When one of their aircraft is shot down, it is difficult to replace. While the United States continues to churn out aircraft after aircraft. Let's see. Eastern Solomons is notable because it's the first deployment of a modern fast battleship in combat. USS North Carolina, the showboat, was escorting Enterprise, and when Enterprise was badly damaged and reported as being sunk, the Japanese then focused their attention on North Carolina. We are in forward secondary battery plot on board USS New Jersey, which means we've got this space and we've got another redundant space. North Carolina doesn't have that redundant space. She just had a secondary plot like this space here. And we're standing at one of the Ford Mark 1A fire control computers, which plots the firing solution for the 5-inch guns. At this point in the war, North Carolina is not yet armed with 40mm guns. So she's got the 20mm guns for closer defense, and the 5-inch guns for long range, and the pretty ineffectual 1.1-inch Chicago pianos for mid-range. But fire control computers like this one allowed North Carolina to aim her 5-inch guns to help drive off attacks on Enterprise, keep Saratoga from being seriously threatened, and then protected her from Japanese dive bombers. This proved to be incredibly successful. Absolutely successful. So future carrier task forces would often be deployed with fast battleships. And the amount of firepower that the fast battleships could put out was just so tremendous that later in the war, American carriers didn't even fire their own anti-aircraft guns. They just relied on the battleships with them to defend them, particularly at nighttime. Another big takeaway from this battle was managing your combat air patrol. Combat air patrol are the fighters that you retain around your aircraft carrier and have in orbit over the fleet to protect your fleet. So at this point, the Americans are still developing fighter direction. So their radars detect incoming aircraft from beyond visual range, and now they have to radio these planes on ultra-high frequency channels that can't be monitored unless you're in really close range, and then direct individual flights to attack enemy formations. This is the first battle in which this is really tried, and it doesn't work particularly effectively. Some 50-odd American fighters are thrown at the Japanese attack, but they don't really do much to blunt it. by later in the war, with experience gained at this battle and other ones like it, the American fighter direction will become state of the art and similar to the systems that our modern carriers still use today. So, in summation, Eastern Settlements, great experience for the U.S., not particularly decisive for either the U.S. or the Japanese. Nobody loses anything significant. However, the Japanese continue to burn their limited resources in personnel and in fuel. And they are not able to resupply their forces on Guadalcanal. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions or comments, drop them in the comment section down below and we'll get back to you. If you're interested in supporting the museum or the channel, check out the description below for ways you can donate. And remember to like, share, and subscribe so you're notified when we have future videos put out.